Hiring managers of Reddit, what's the most strange or cringeworthy thing a potential candidate has said or done during the interview? Story 1. I was once really nervous at the end of my job interview and for some reason decided to stroke one of the office plants as the hiring manager walked me to the exit. Then I laughed awkwardly and said in a surprised tone, "They're real." He was not impressed and I did not get the job. Story 2. At my previous job, I was interviewing candidates for a position within my team. One of the applicants was internal, so I knew of her and knew she had a few cats as pets. So the day of the interview arrives, in she comes and we start with the basics. I then ask a few competency-based questions and she starts giving me answers not based on her work experience. She had trained overseas teams and had an impressive CV, but by relating the answers to her cats. For example, I asked her, "Can you give me an example of your leadership skills?" I kid you not, her answer was along the lines of, "Well, I have 2 cats, and around feeding them, I need to make sure cat 1 gets fed first, as cat 2 has a weight problem, and will try to eat cat 1's food. I need to ensure I lead by making sure cat 2 is well kept away from cat 1 until he's finished his food." She then showed me some pictures of the cats in question. And don't get me wrong, they were some mighty fine beasts. Cat 2 was a fat old beast, and I have a pet cat myself. But I was a bit surprised. I did get some decent answers from her on occasion, but it was a very surreal interview. She didn't get the job. Story 3. This is too good to pass up, so here you go. A few years ago, we put out an app for a senior software developer. The description was rather broad. We had a variety of projects that we could stick them on, but needed a senior-level person that could jump in relatively quickly. In comes this lady, let's name her Susan, with an excellent resume. 10 years of development experience, lead-level previous position, listed proficiencies in all of the languages we wanted, even obscure ones. Who the hell still knows XSLT, for example? So we bring her in for an interview, one of those public sector committee ones with preset questions, and she's acing it. Talks a big game excitedly describing her past projects and their impact, and seems all around pretty personable. Then we deviate a bit and start asking basic coding questions, and she replies with a line that I will never forget as long as I live. "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't really do coding. I have my Chinaman for that." 5 seconds of stunned silence. I beg your pardon? My Chinaman. Let's call him Bob. If something needs doing, I pass it off to him and it's just done. He's really good. When we inquired if we could maybe interview this Chinaman instead, she got really flustered and basically wound the interview down. It's like we committed a great offense by implying that 2 of them were separate entities. To this day, we don't really know what the deal there was exactly. Story 4. I've had some ridiculous interviews. One older white woman said, "Will I have to work with Middle Easterners?" And she pointed to a guy outside of the meeting room. The guy was of an Indian heritage and was born here. I said, Mike's not from the Middle East. Her, in a whisper, "You know what I mean, brown people. I work for a tech company." Another guy seems nice during introductions, and then I ask my first question. "That's your first question? You're not gonna ask about the break in my experience?" Me. "No, I care about whether you can do this job, not what you've done in the past year." Him. "But why wouldn't you ask that first?" Me. "Because I want to know about the work you did at this other company." Him. "Well, I wrote a novel, you know, and it got published. Did you Google me and know that already?" Me. "I Googled you, I didn't see anything about a novel, but that isn't pertinent here. Can you address the question?" Him. "The movie rights were optioned, I just finished my second novel. I'm looking for a publisher. You want to know what it's about?" Me. "Not right now, maybe Him. "It's this great story." Me. "I'm sorry, you're gonna have to leave. If you can't tell me about your practical experience, then you're not suited for this role." Story 5. I was interviewing for a tech writing position at an engineering company. The first part of the interview with the communications manager went really well, and she brought me in to speak with the head of engineering. He asked me lots of questions about organizing documentation and where sections would go and why. At one point, he started asking about cars. He then wanted me to write a list of all the different parts of a car, and after completing my list, separate them into sections, something like safety, use, maintenance, etc. So I started listing parts, and he keeps telling me to keep on adding to it. Eventually, I filled the whole page, and he keeps telling me to continue. I maybe know more about cars than the average 20-something women, but by no means am I a car aficionado. This job has nothing to do with cars. I am confused. I have no idea what this list is missing. Eventually, I tell him so. He looks me dead in the eyes and explains that I forgot to list wheels. My very extensive list of car parts has no wheels. Certain that I've bombed the interview for this very obvious and stupid oversight anyway, I replied, "It's a hovercraft." I got the job. Sometimes being a sassy idiot gets you hired. Boss later told me that she liked me the whole interview, but the hovercraft comment was what cemented her decision to hire me. Story 6. I interviewed a 30-year-old guy who had gotten all his previous jobs through connections. It was his first job interview ever. Although he turned out to be the sweetest, nicest, gentlest person you could imagine, he looked like an axe-murdering serial kidnapper, sex-fiend motorcycle gang member, psychopath. The dude was genuinely scary looking. He was super quiet, super shy, and so nervous about his interview that he was sweating like crazy. Overall, he wasn't making a good impression. He said in the interview, "I know I look scary and I'm really shy, so people might think I'm a psycho, but I'm not like some freaking criminal. I'm just a nice guy." He then realized that he said the F word while admitting that people were scared of him. He then said, "I imagine this isn't going very well." I ended up hiring him, and he was the best worker and one of the nicest people I've ever known in my life. Story 7. Alright, it wasn't during an interview, but a kid looking to get hired at my store came in and asked to speak with me. I was out the day he came in, so he asked my coworkers the next day that I would be there and planned to come back. Well, 2 days later when I was back, he came back, with his grandmother. Now, this didn't bother me at first because we have hired some kids who were too young to drive but had a good head on their shoulders. What did bother me is when the kid stood by the door and the grandmother came to talk to me alone. She started having the interview for him when I didn't even plan on giving the kid an interview yet. She handed me a resume that I'm fairly sure she designed in paint, and started spouting out all these really admirable traits about this kid. Meanwhile, he just stood by the door and looked straight down at his shoes. She told me what a hard worker he was and how quick of a learner he was, and because this was a retail job, she tried to tell me how personable he was. I shit you not, this lady looked me dead in the eyes with her grandson standing 50 feet away and tried to tell me that he was great with people and that he had no problems approaching anyone. I was stunned. I kindly told her that I would keep his resume on file, but at that moment we were not looking for any new employees. She thanks me and shakes my hand and walks over to her grandson. She whispered something in his ear and he walks over to me. He didn't say a word, he just sticks his hand out at me. I went to shake his hand and I'm not entirely sure he understood the concept of a handshake. I was grabbing his hand and shaking while he just let his limp, clammy hand sit in my grasp until it was over. He then turned around and left. Dude, you should have said, "Hey man, come over, let me talk to you." He was humiliated. Probably not at his fault. Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the video. If you are, it would mean a lot if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. Anyway, back to the stories. Story 8. There are a couple I remember. The guy showed up drunk for an operations manager interview. Short perfunctory interview followed by a "don't call us, we'll call you." The guy showed up in a tie and suit vest for a near minimum wage unskilled labor job. Got the job and turned out to be a pretty good worker. Interviewing for general manager. While shaking my hand before the interview begins, "I'll have your job someday." Offered him an ops supervisor position instead and he took it. Didn't last long. And the cardinal sin of interview behavior. I've seen this too often to recall all of them. The interviewee complains about the previous employer being an idiot or a bigot. Still makes me cringe every time. I also vividly remember this one. We were interviewing to fill a bunch of low-level positions like forklift operators and the like in a warehouse. We were hiring a few dozen lift operators, and we were having an open-door event, a first-come, first-served sort of affair where we interviewed a bunch of candidates, meet them, and give a go/no-go to them, and tell them to come in for training the following week or not. There's a start and an end time for these. This happens often, and we'll turn away a few people once the window closes. One of the candidates shows up late, ragged-looking, and sweaty. We had already filled in the position, so my HR manager meets with him to explain. She comes into my office crying because it turns out this guy walked 3 hours to get here as he is, and I mean completely broke. When she turned him away, he started crying. Nothing quite like seeing a grown man pushed to the limit finally break down and cry. When this guy was turned away, he broke down and my HR manager tried to calm him down, and we got the notion that he was broke and stuff. She came in to see me in tears, had a conversation, and looked over some numbers. Figured we lose a few through attrition in the beginning anyway. Took maybe 20 minutes. When she went out to start the interview, he was gone. We get resumes at the beginning of the interview, so we never took his information. We felt really bad for him, had a quick meeting to create a new position, and when we all went to tell him, he'd left. That one still haunts me. I felt bad, but it was a busy day, so I got back to work. Been thinking about this guy ever since. I handle job rodeos a little differently now. I try and use remote sites, and we'll stay as long as candidates come in. We won't hire on the spot, although we'll score them right away, and we'll take resumes first thing. Essentially, this is what we do with a large startup, except now we apply similar policies for medium to small startups as well. And if he gets the job, presumably, he wouldn't be walking to work every day. You get an advance on your first week and arrange transportation somehow. Story 9. IT headhunter here. One of my partners vetted a candidate. He cleared his background check and was savvy enough for the help desk job he was going for. Seemed a little off, but he was overall a nice guy. Goes out to the client, sits down in the chair, crosses his legs, and grins. The first words out of his mouth are, "Do you know who I am? I've been on the news." He then tells me the tale of his time in the psych ward. He recently had his house condemned and refused to leave. When the cops tried to go in and remove him, he yelled that he had guns and would kill any cop that walks in through the door. So SWAT got to go and fetch him, and they put him in the nut house for a little while. The little known fact to us, certain levels of psych holds do not come up on the background checks because they aren't classified as criminal offenses. He Googles all of his candidates now to make sure they haven't been on the news anymore. Story 10. My dad was a location manager for a wholesale agricultural supply company in a small town in Central Florida. The location needed an administrative assistant to answer phones and such. Kind of entry-level stuff, but you could expect to see applicants from all skill sets and experience levels. He received a decent-looking resume from a woman who appeared to be between 18 and 20. And carried decent work experience, so he set up an interview. She called the day before and asked about the company dress code. Dad replied that the interview would be business formal. It's probably important to mention a few things here. First, he was impressed that she'd called and asked. For an entry-level job, it showed some initiative, and he appreciated the confidence needed to call and ask a question like that rather than wing it and hope for the best. Next, we're talking about Central Florida. If he said the dress code was casual, there would be a better than average chance that the candidate would just show up in shorts and flip-flops. If he said that it was business casual, you can expect blue jeans and a t-shirt. By saying business formal, he expected to see her arrive in pants that weren't blue jeans or a skirt of some kind. That isn't what happened. She missed the business and business formal and arrived in a full-length blue sequin prom dress. She was so uncomfortable. Everybody was so uncomfortable that she bombed the interview and didn't get the job. Story 11. Okay, not a hiring manager, but the most cringeworthy thing I did in a job interview, yet it was an interview for a team leader position in Six Flags. The hiring manager asked me where I see myself in 10 years. And I told her the head of the operations of Six Flags Astroworld. At the time, I just got back to the US after being in Europe for 3 years. What I didn't know was that Astroworld had been closed and all the rides were sold off and moved to other parks. She corrected me right away, and that was the end of the interview. I didn't get the job. Story 12. This was an interview for a personal banking position at the Bank Mart, a convenience bank within a supermarket. He was a hulking man, well over 6 foot, and with the build of a linebacker. His jacket looked like it came from a golfer in the 90s, like a patchwork quilt. He was sitting on the edge of his chair, blinking rapidly and sweating. A lot. I asked if he had any experience in customer service or retail, and he loudly told me, "I do not, but I am motivated as hell. I would talk to every person here." He is selling this to us like a gospel preacher. "I will run to them in the aisles and ask about their banking. I will help them find what they are looking for and bring them back to the bank. I will talk to every last person here." This went on for several minutes before I thanked him for his time and told him we'd get back to him. Story 13. Guy applied for a programming position and he had programmed in his work history. He makes it to the face-to-face stage and comes into the office for an interview. Most programming interviews will throw some basic programming questions at you just to prove you know what you're doing. This guy got the fizz buzz question, loop through 1 to 100, print fizz if it's a multiple of 3, buzz if it's a multiple of 5, and fizz buzz if both. He was told to make a start and just sat there umming and ahhing. So the lead developer and head developer just assumed he was nervous and tried to help walk him through it, breaking down the questions for him, dropping hints, etc. They get down to the question, okay, can you just write an empty for loop? The guy couldn't even do that. He must have lied on his application and somehow cheated on the entry tests. A friend did it, Google, etc. Sadly, this happens a lot in programming. People assume it's just to do with computers, how hard can it be? Story 14. I participated in the interview process when I left my last company, but I wasn't the hiring manager. As we sat in the interview with one highly intelligent interviewee, he had a 3.94 GPA in chemical engineering, we quickly realized why he would not be a good candidate. For one, he decided to pull out this really ratty old binder from his broken down backpack. Who brings backpacks to interviews anyway? In that binder, he had a bunch of poetry he wanted to share. Specifically, he wanted us to listen to him read to us his Ode to Benzene. For 4 minutes, all 4 of us interviewers had to awkwardly sit there as this kid went on and on about benzene. Then when he started talking about his skills with Excel, he mentioned how he has created a sociability chart. What is this chart, pray to tell? Well, he's created some kind of algorithm to measure how social he is per day. If he leaves his room to get a meal, he gets X points for that day. If he speaks to a girl, it's worth double. He proudly exclaimed how after this interviewer, since all 4 of us were female, he would be able to double his sociability score for left the room and spoke for an hour with another human. He offered to pull up his laptop to show how his chart had steadily increased in slope over the past few months, kindly explaining that it was in part due to him preparing for this interview. It was then my responsibility to bring this poor boy on a tour of our lab facilities in the office area of the company. The entire time he had his eyes glued to my boobs. Sadly, he did not get the job. I wish him well in life though, and hopefully someday he can find a girl or employer that loves benzene just as much as him. Story 15. Our company had an entry-level IT support desk position open. The candidate's resume included information on a master's level of education. I found it odd that someone that young with that level of education and a decent background in IT would be applying for a level 1 help desk position. When I checked him out, they had no record of him ever attending. His bachelor school checked out that he had completed 2 years of education, all of which HR had failed to check on. The panel interview was already scheduled, so I just informed the other panelists before he arrived. The guy shows up in a nice suit, briefcase, notepad, etc. Well pre-prepared. He answered the other panelists' questions and was frankly knocking the interview out of the park until it was finally my turn. I told him that we had noted some discrepancies on his resume, specifically regarding his education, and I was hoping he could clear things up. At which point he began weeping, which would then lead to sobbing. It was one of the most cringeworthy moments of my career. Story 16. I run a call center and was interviewing a candidate in between calls. She was a rather large girl. She had been referred by a trusted colleague and his resume was stellar. During the interview, which was very professional, my lunch came. Hot wings. I put them to the side and continued the interview. It went great and I hired her on the spot. We exchanged pleasantries on the way out. Then she stopped and said, "Man, let me get one of them wings. The food smells good as a mother trucker." I gave her a wing. She's still my top producer 8 years later. Story 17. Was an assistant manager at a fairly popular boot store. Did interviews when my manager wasn't available. A chubby Mexican chick with acne and a weird smell came in for an interview. Her sob story was that she had 3 kids and the father was in prison for 15 years, and she was about to be kicked out of her apartment, so she needed the job badly. The interview was going okay, and then I read her resume. No high school diploma, and her only other jobs were as an Avon rep. Told her we can't hire her without a diploma or general equivalency diploma. She starts crying. Then she offers me a job and said I could get one anytime if I wanted to hire her. I declined. I really wanted one, but morals. We end the interview. She asked when my manager will be in. I said tomorrow morning. She said she'll come to talk to him. She got hired by him and he set up a schedule where those two would only be close together. When I quit, she was still there and promoted to my old position after only 5 months. Story 18. Not said, but had as a phone voicemail. I had a candidate scheduled for a phone call. I called him and got his voicemail. It was a 4-minute skit of him playing the part of Dirty Harry's "Do You Feel Lucky Punk" in the worst possible impression I have ever heard of anything ever in my life. To invite you to the scene, he was very Indian and perhaps Chinese mixture. His voice was nothing like Clint Eastwood, and his impression missed keywords and points of the phrasing. Overall, the experience was memorable enough for me to call him back just to learn more about this guy. In the end, he was not a good cultural fit for the work environment, so we didn't hire him, but goddamn was his voicemail hilarious. Story 19. I interviewed at least 5 potential caregivers a week to work with seniors that have dementia. We don't ask the typical job interview questions, we ask them a series of common scenarios they will encounter and see how they will react or respond. One of the questions is, what would you do if you walk into a client's room and they start screaming at you to get out? The correct answer is some variation of leaving for a few minutes and coming back with a big smile on your face, and usually they'll be happy to see you. One caregiver said that she would bear hug the client into submission because she doesn't tolerate any disrespect. When I tried to tell her that that's the opposite of what she would do, she replied, "No, I would stick with the bear hug."